The crystal chimes on the patio table tinkled a careless, happy song, oblivious to the cold dread pooling in my stomach. The air smelled of expensive barbecue smoke and the faint, sweet perfume of the women gathered. Laughter drifted, warm and easy, a stark contrast to the sudden chill I felt settling deep in my bones. He was talking, his voice just a little too loud, amplified by a cocktail and an audience. Our friends, people we'd shared dinners, holidays, years with, were leaning in, captivated by his performance. I saw his face, flushed with wine, eyes sparkling with a cruel amusement I knew too well, a smile that didn't reach them. He gestured vaguely in my direction, though he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at them, basking in their anticipation. And then he said it. The words sliced through the easy hum of conversation like a razor, sharp and precise, aimed directly at my back. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Honestly, he scoffed, the sound dripping with mock sympathy. Bless her heart. She thinks this little venture is going to work. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. A few nervous titters. I stood frozen by the grill, the spatula heavy in my hand, the scent of burning meat suddenly acrid. He finally turned to face me, that same fake smile fixed on his face. It was a mask of concern, but his eyes were triumphant. I give it until Christmas. Honestly, folks, mark my words. She'll be broke by Christmas. Broke by Christmas. The words hung there, suspended in the twilight air, heavier than the smoke, colder than the ice in the drinks. He said it with such certainty, such finality. Not as a worry, not as a hope for caution, but as a prediction. A prophecy delivered with a smirk. My hands started to shake. The friends, moments before warm and familiar, now felt like a jury. Their eyes flickered between him and me, some sympathetic, some merely curious, a few, his closest buddies, of course, sharing his smug amusement. He didn't just predict my failure, he announced it. He stamped it with his authority, with the weight of his supposed business acumen, with the implied foolishness of my own efforts. This was Michael, my husband, the man who had stood beside me, hand in hand, through years of building a life together. The man who had theoretically supported my dreams, my ambitions, my independent spirit. Or so I had thought. This was the moment the facade crumbled, not with a bang, but with a carefully calculated, public whisper amplified into a shout. Before this, life had a rhythm, a comfortable predictability that, looking back, feels almost naive. Michael was the successful one, the one with the corner office and the impressive title. My business, a tech startup focused on sustainable solutions, was my passion project, my leap of faith. I had poured everything into it, my savings, my time, my energy, my very identity. It wasn't a hobby, it was my future, my contribution to the world, my proof that I could build something meaningful on my own terms. We had talked about it, of course. He'd offered advice, usually laced with a subtle condescension I'd chosen to ignore, attributing it to his naturally competitive nature. He'd nod along as I talked about funding rounds, product development, market strategy. He'd occasionally introduce me to someone in his network, always with a preamble that positioned me as the ambitious wife with her little company. I'd bristled inwardly, but bit my tongue. I told myself he was just being protective, maybe a little proud in his own awkward way. But that night on the patio, the truth was laid bare. It wasn't awkward pride. It was contempt. It wasn't protection. It was undermining. He wasn't predicting failure because he genuinely feared for me. He was predicting it because he wanted it. He wanted it announced, witnessed, validated by the people whose opinions mattered to him. My success, my independence, threatened something fundamental in him. It disrupted the established order where he was the provider, the authority, the one who made the real money. And so, he chose to dismantle me, piece by public piece. The rest of the evening is a blur of forced smiles and choked down humiliation. I tried to talk to people, to act normal, but his words echoed in every silence, every averted glance. I felt exposed, vulnerable, My dreams reduced to a punchline delivered by the person who was supposed to be my staunchest ally. Friends approached later, offering awkward condolences or forced optimism. "He didn't mean it like that," one whispered, while another just patted my arm sympathetically. They knew. We all knew. The air was thick with the unspoken confirmation that Michael had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That night, the house felt vast and empty. The silence between us was deafening. He came to bed as if nothing had happened, humming softly, scrolling on his phone. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the words "broke by Christmas" repeating like a broken record in my mind. It wasn't just the financial threat, it was the profound personal betrayal. The man I loved, the man who had vowed to cherish and support me, had just publicly humiliated me and declared my deepest aspirations doomed. It felt like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The days that followed were a different kind of hell. The news, as cruel gossip tends to do, traveled fast. When I reached out to potential investors I had networked with through Michael, the conversations were subtly different. There was a hesitation, a guarded politeness that wasn't there before. One person, a longtime acquaintance of Michael's, even referenced his prediction, cloaked in a laugh. "Heard you were bracing for a lean Christmas," they chuckled. The poison had spread. Michael hadn't just said it. He had planted seeds of doubt that were now sprouting in the fertile ground of the business community. My early attempts to counter it felt clumsy, desperate. I doubled down on work, trying to project an image of confidence and success. I sent out more pitches, attended more networking events, plastering a brave smile on my face. But inside, I was bleeding. Every rejection, every stalled conversation, felt like a confirmation of his words. The energy I usually channeled into innovation was being drained by the constant effort of fighting against the narrative he had created. I felt like I was running in quicksand. The harder I tried, the faster I sank. The financial reality was stark. Startups burn cash, and I had underestimated the impact of the subtle but pervasive loss of confidence around my venture. A crucial funding round stalled. A major potential client, who had seemed enthusiastic, suddenly went silent. Expenses mounted. Payroll loomed. Every spreadsheet felt like a ticking clock counting down to Michael's predicted deadline. I cut costs ruthlessly, working round the clock, skipping meals, sleeping only a few hours a night. The strain was immense, not just on me, but on the small, dedicated team I had assembled. They saw the pressure, felt the uncertainty, and I hated that I couldn't shield them from it. One evening, huddled over invoices at 3 a.m., the numbers just didn't add up. There was no magic solution, no hidden stash of cash. The next payroll was a terrifying impossibility. A wave of nausea washed over me. Michael's words echoed again, louder this time, laced with the sound of his mocking laughter from that night. He was right. He was going to be right. The humiliation wasn't just a temporary sting. It was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, set in motion by his own hand. Despair settled over me like a shroud. I started withdrawing. I stopped going to social events where I might encounter people who had heard his prediction. I barely spoke to Michael. The distance between us was now an ocean. He seemed oblivious, or perhaps intentionally ignorant, of the devastation he had wrought. He would ask about my day, his tone bland, and I would give curt, non-committal answers. He'd occasionally make a passive-aggressive comment about my stress levels or the risks I had taken. Each word was a tiny twist of a knife. The deepening crisis wasn't just financial, it was existential. Who was I if my dream failed?
Who was I married to?
The foundation of my life felt unstable, cracked by betrayal and crumbling under financial pressure. I stood on the precipice, staring into the abyss of failure and public humiliation. All my efforts felt futile. The fight seemed pointless. Michael had won. His carefully placed words had done their damage, proving more effective than any direct sabotage could have been. He had weaponized social dynamics, using our shared circle to isolate and discredit me. It was insidious, brilliant in its cruelty. One afternoon, I was sitting in my empty office, the the silence amplifying the sound of my own ragged breath. A notification popped up on my phone, a business publication article quoting Michael on market trends. His picture stared back at me, confident, successful, everything I felt I wasn't. I read his words, full of pronouncements about growth and opportunity, and felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. He was thriving, publicly lauded, while I was drowning, thanks in part to him. And then something shifted. It wasn't a sudden burst of inspiration, but a slow, simmering realization, like molten metal cooling into an unbreakable form. He hadn't just hurt me, he had underestimated me. He had assumed that predicting my failure would cause my failure. He hadn't accounted for the fire that betrayal can ignite. He thought I would fold, fade away, perhaps even come crawling back to him, admitting his superior judgment. But looking at his smug face in that article, hearing his mocking words echo one last time, I saw not just my pain, but his vulnerability. His need to diminish me revealed his own insecurity. His public prophecy wasn't about me. It was about him, about reinforcing his own status. And if it was about status, maybe status could be used against him. The idea began to form, not fully fleshed out, but a glimmer of possibility in the suffocating darkness. What if I didn't just survive? What if I didn't just recover? What if I didn't just prove him wrong? What if I turned his weapon, public perception, public statements, against him, and didn't just win, but won so spectacularly, so undeniably, that it rendered his words not just wrong, but laughably, tragically incorrect? The midpoint shift was complete. I stopped focusing on merely surviving until Christmas. I started focusing on a different date, a different outcome. The objective was no longer solvency. It was vindication. The strategy wasn't damage control. It was a full-scale, silent counterstrike. Michael had fired his shot, announcing my impending doom to the world. I would answer not with words, but with an event. An event so big, so undeniable, that it would make his prophecy the punchline and him the fool. The $50 million deal, which had been a distant, almost impossible target, suddenly became the only target that mattered. The realization brought a strange kind of calm. The despair didn't vanish entirely, but it was overlaid with a fierce, cold determination. My focus narrowed. The noise of his betrayal, the whispers, the financial dread, they faded into the background, replaced by the singular, relentless pursuit of this one, massive goal. This was my turning point. I made the decision, not out of anger or revenge, not entirely, but out of a deep-seated need to reclaim my narrative, to rebuild my life on a foundation of my own making, and to show him, and everyone who had heard him, the true cost of his casual cruelty. I would pursue the $50 million deal with every fiber of my being. It wasn't just a business transaction anymore. It was my armor, my weapon, my declaration of independence. The risk was astronomical. Failure now wouldn't just be quiet insolvency. It would be a loud, public confirmation of his every word. But the thought of letting him be right, of living under the shadow of his mockery forever, was a far greater terror than any financial ruin. I would bet everything on this. Everything. The struggle to land the $50 million deal was brutal, a relentless uphill battle fought in the shadows. Michael knew nothing of it. I became a ghost in my own home, living a double life. By day, or more often by night, I was a fierce negotiator, a relentless networker, a strategic planner operating with absolute secrecy. By evening, I was the quiet wife, occasionally asked about my struggling business, offering vague, discouraging updates to maintain the illusion of impending failure. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, and isolating. Every pitch felt like an interrogation. Investors were wary, cautious. The market was tough. There were moments I wanted to scream, to give up, to admit defeat. Nights spent poring over term sheets, legal documents, financial models until my eyes burned. Early mornings were spent on calls with potential partners in different time zones. The pressure was immense. I had to appear confident, competent, and resilient, even when my internal world was a crumbling mess of fear and exhaustion. There were countless setbacks. Deals that looked promising fell through at the last minute. Negotiations stalled. People I relied on disappointed me. Each hurdle felt amplified by the stakes. This wasn't just about securing funding, it was about securing my future, my dignity, my very sense of self-worth. Michael's voice, predicting my failure, was a constant phantom presence, pushing me, sometimes almost breaking me. But each time I felt the urge to collapse, I would see his face that night, hear the casual cruelty in his voice, and the cold resolve would return, harder than before. I built a small, tight-knit team within my company, bringing in only the absolute essentials, bound by non-disclosure agreements that went far beyond the norm. We worked in secret, meeting in anonymous coffee shops or late at night in my sparsely furnished office. The air in those meetings crackled with a shared sense of purpose, of being part of something momentous and intensely private. They knew the company was in trouble. They didn't know the scale of the battle being fought behind the scenes, or the intensely personal motivation driving it. I told them it was a crucial pivot, a desperate gamble to save the company. Part of that was true. The deeper I got into the negotiations, the clearer the path became, albeit a terrifyingly narrow one. The $50 million wasn't going to be a single investment, but a complex combination of equity, strategic partnerships, and a significant debt facility, structured around a major long-term contract I was trying to land with a large, established corporation. This corporation was notoriously difficult to work with, slow-moving, and risk-averse. Securing their commitment was the linchpin of the entire $50 million structure. Without them, the investors wouldn't commit the capital, and the debt wouldn't be secured. It felt like trying to thread a needle while standing in a hurricane. Michael, meanwhile, continued his life, seemingly unaware. He'd complain about work stress, about trivial office politics. He'd ask, with feigned sympathy, if I had started looking for a real job, yet, given the state of my company, I would shrug, say things were tight, and let him think his prediction was unfolding exactly as planned. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. He was so confident in his narrative of my failure that he was blind to the reality I was meticulously constructing beneath his nose.
He saw what he wanted to see.
His arrogance was my greatest shield. The negotiation with the large corporation dragged on for months. Layers of bureaucracy, endless meetings, due diligence that felt like an autopsy of my business. Each week was a roller coaster of hope and crushing disappointment. There were moments I was convinced it was over, that I had failed, that Michael would be proven right. I'd spend hours just staring out the window, feeling the weight of inevitable humiliation pressing down. But then, a small breakthrough. A key contact within the corporation, someone who believed in my vision, quietly championed my proposal. An investor I'd almost given up on suddenly showed renewed interest, perhaps sensing the strategic potential of the corporate partnership. The pieces, agonizingly slowly, began to align. The week of the final negotiations with the corporation was a blur of sleeplessness and adrenaline. Every phone call was fraught with tension. Every email was dissected for hidden meaning. The legal teams battled over clauses. The financial models were stress-tested to their breaking point. My team and I lived on coffee and nervous energy. Michael commented on my exhaustion, suggesting I was working too hard on a lost cause. I just nodded, letting him think it. The fewer questions he asked, the safer the secret. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the corporate deal was signed. The ink was barely dry before I was on calls with the investors and lenders. The corporate contract was the proof they needed, the security they demanded. The dominoes began to fall into place. The complex financial structure, the $50 million puzzle, started coming together with breathtaking speed. It was real. It was actually happening. The announcement was scheduled for a major industry conference, one Michael often attended, though he usually dismissed my industry as niche and insignificant. The corporation was making a presentation about their new strategic direction, and my company was a key part of that announcement. The investors and lenders would be there. Our friends, the ones who had heard Michael's prediction, were often at this conference too, as it was a major event in our city's business calendar. The day of the conference arrived, crisp and bright, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. I wore a suit that felt like armor. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't just a professional moment, it was a personal reckoning. I saw Michael from across the crowded convention hall, deep in conversation with some colleagues. He looked relaxed, confident, utterly unaware that his personal doomsday clock was about to strike midnight on him. The main stage was huge, screens flashing corporate logos. The CEO of the large corporation began his presentation, speaking about innovation and future growth. My company's name flashed on the screen. A hush fell over the audience as he transitioned to the partnership announcement. I stood backstage, waiting for my cue. My hands were clammy. My mind flashed back to that night on the patio, the scent of barbecue, the tinkle of the chimes. Michael's voice sang, "She'll be broke by Christmas." The memory fueled a cold, exhilarating surge of power. Then, my name was called. I walked out onto the stage, blinking in the bright lights, a confident smile on my face. The CEO introduced me, detailing the partnership, its strategic importance, and the massive investment and financing package secured to fund the collaboration. He announced the number, $50 million. The sound was deafening. Not applause, not immediately. It was a collective gasp. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. On the screen behind us, graphics detailed the scale of the deal. $50 million. My company named front and center. I scanned the audience, looking for Michael. He was in the third row. His face, moments before composed and smug, was now a mask of utter shock. His eyes were wide, staring at the screen, at me, back at the screen. His mouth was open, working soundlessly. He looked like he'd been physically struck. The color drained from his face. And then he reacted. Not with a scream, not a literal shout that everyone could hear, but a strangled, choked sound, a guttural expulsion of disbelief and rage that cut through the buzzing crowd right to my core. His hands flew up, gripping the sides of his head. He half rose from his seat, eyes locked on me with an expression of horror and betrayal so profound it was almost comical. He wasn't screaming words, he was screaming at reality. His reality, the one where I was supposed to fail, was shattering before his eyes on a massive public stage. He looked utterly blindsided, demolished by the sheer, undeniable fact of the $50 million. He had predicted ruin, and I stood there, bathed in the glow of a victory he couldn't possibly comprehend. His public mockery had backfired with spectacular, devastating force. The plot twist wasn't just that I succeeded, it was that my success was announced here, now, in front of everyone who had heard his prophecy, making him the prophet of his own undoing. I finished my remarks, composed and professional, even managed a brief, genuine smile at the cheering crowd. Inside, a storm raged, relief, triumph, a profound sadness for the man who had stood beside me and then tried to tear me down. Leaving the stage felt like walking on air and sinking into leads simultaneously. The congratulations were overwhelming, a sea of faces I barely registered. I saw Michael being ushered out by a concerned friend, still looking pale and shell-shocked. There was no confrontation, not then. The public announcement was the confrontation, the ultimate, undeniable answer to his cruel prediction. The aftermath was complex, a messy tangle of emotions and practicalities. The business thrived, of course. The $50 million wasn't just money, it was validation, opportunity, the fuel to realize the vision I'd fought so hard for. My team was ecstatic, relieved, energized. The industry took notice. Suddenly, my little venture was anything but little. My personal life, however, was in ruins. Michael and I barely spoke. The betrayal, compounded by the public nature of the climax, was a chasm between us. He tried, feebly, to explain himself, mumbled something about being worried, about tough love. The words were hollow, drowned out by the echo of "broke by Christmas" and the image of his face when the $50 million was announced. There was no going back. The trust was shattered beyond repair. You can't mend a foundation after one person has deliberately tried to demolish it. We separated quietly. The division of assets felt strangely anticlimactic after the public drama, just logistics. Our friends were awkward. Some apologized for not speaking up that night. Others simply expressed astonishment. The ones who had aligned with Michael faded away. New connections were made, based on respect for my accomplishments, not on my relationship status. The victory was sweet, undeniably so. It was everything I had worked for and more. But it was also tinged with sadness. The cost of his betrayal wasn't just financial strain. It was the loss of a marriage, the erosion of years of shared history. I had won, spectacularly, undeniably. But the win came at a price. I stood taller, stronger, fiercely independent. I had built something magnificent out of the ashes of his cruelty. I had proven him wrong in the most definitive way imaginable. But the echo of his laughter, the sting of his words, and the profound disappointment in the man I had married lingered, a quiet reminder that some wounds, even those inflicted by words, leave permanent scars. I was not broke by Christmas. I was unbound, and that, in the end, was worth far more than $50 million. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.